As part of my philosopher series on YouTube, I have talked about skepticism, and I have talked about it filtered through the lens of Sextus Empiricus, who was an ancient Roman philosopher. And I have often described how skepticism is a perspective that I find to be very meaningful and interesting in my life for challenging my own beliefs, for keeping me open to the world, and allowing me to understand things in more nuanced and complicated ways. And so I think what comes out of Sextus Empiricus is this idea that we are able to be skeptical of the things that we take for granted and that we take to be immediately true. And I think that there is definitely a lot of value in being able to be skeptical and being able to question your point of view and your own assumptions and being able to challenge them and to be able to realize that the world is much more open-ended than we might ever realize, and that it does to a large extent exist outside of our own narrow conceptions. There is another idea that comes out of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which is that of circular reasoning. And this is the idea that you need reason in order to actually reason, you need knowledge in order to explain knowledge, you need evidence in order to explain evidence, and you need a variety of explanations in order to explain explanations. And this is an interesting idea which has influenced me, but here's what I would like to say in conjunction with these two ideas that I've mentioned, is that if you take circular reasoning to be the only way that you can make assumptions about the world, or the only way that you can gain knowledge or understand things, then you find yourself to be very limited, because then there is nothing that you can prove. You have essentially created an anti-foundationalist existence and explanation of things, because you can't ground anything in reality, and because you have unwittingly limited yourself. And it is the same with skepticism overall in the way that I've talked about, in that if I am talking about skeptical thinking, in that I always want to challenge every little detail of my beliefs because I think that they're wrong, and because I don't want to assume anything, you can end up in the opposite place, to where you actually end up very, so skeptical that you might become nihilistic, or at least don't believe anything, because there is nothing for you to actually believe. And so I've been thinking about this through thinking about philosophy. And one of the things that I have understood about my understanding of my own skeptical approach is that in my life I have and do take skepticism too far. It seems to me as though my doubts and me doubting the things that I think are so true or obvious might actually prevent me from learning more about the world, from using knowledge in order to understand knowledge, from using reason in order to reason. And I find that to be limiting whenever I take that too far. It seems to me as though I doubt myself too much then, that I am too skeptical, that I am not looking at things in a much more open-ended way, because I am actually shutting myself down and preventing myself from coming to conclusions. Now, I know that the flip side of this is that we become too arrogant and we assume that we shouldn't be questioned. We don't question assumptions, even obvious assumptions, because we think that it is always true. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. But I do and have started to think that assumptions are part of framing a foundation for knowledge, of being able to think about anything at all. And I do think that that is very important to keep in mind, because the reality is that we do need to have some kind of assumption in order to understand the world. We are in the world, and the world does have a set of facts that it could potentially be reduced to, facts which we can use to build knowledge. And I'll admit, it isn't easy for me to realize these things, to have to admit that, that my skepticism is too critical of me and of the facts and evidence that I see in the world. But it is something that I think is very important for me to uncover, and something I have been uncovering throughout the years. It seems to me as though I have doubted myself way too much, and that I want to be able to come to some kind of understanding of the world by realizing that the world still exists regardless of what I may think, regardless of how skeptical I may be of it. And even though it may be difficult to assign what is real at times, there are still things, just with the help of science and the accumulation of knowledge throughout the centuries, that we can use in order to build upon and create a foundation of knowledge. And I think that that is very important to keep in mind. So for me, I have had to try to understand that we should have a balance. We should definitely challenge ourselves and challenge our assumptions, but it is also okay to assume certain things whenever it does act as a good basis for believing in something and for accumulating more evidence. A good way that I heard it described is that Hume himself, David Hume, the philosopher, was very skeptical, and he was questioning causality itself and whether or not anything could be the cause of anything. But he wouldn't say that at the end of the day that you literally should believe that to the extreme, to the point to where you don't even think reality exists or planets exist or the earth exists. And if you take that skepticism too far, you really limit yourself and you can't actually prove anything at all. And that isn't a good place to be. And so the way that I had heard it described with David Hume is that David Hume still wants to build on knowledge. He still wants to show that there are things that we can learn and things that we can gain in understanding. And I think that that is definitely a very good way of putting it, because I do think that there is value in realizing these things. And so challenge your assumptions, but it is understandable, obviously, in order to lay some kind of foundation for truth and for knowledge and what you can actually prove. It is good to understand that we are in the world and that there are things that it is okay to take for granted because they will exist whether we like it or not. They will exist whether we think they need to exist or not, and that is the way that it will be. And so I myself don't want to be so skeptical that I don't believe in anything, that I always think that I'm wrong. I want to be able to get to a point to where I am able to acknowledge the things that I've learned through time and the things that I have been able to understand. So yeah, have a balanced skepticism. Have a skepticism that allows you to let go of the too much of the baggage, but that allows you to realize the things that are true in your own life and that help you exist. Obviously, we're still going to trust medicine and science and technology, at least from a practical, technical perspective, because they do know the ways in which the principles and laws of Earth and the world and the universe work. And that is a very interesting thing to keep in mind, that we must be able to trust those processes in order to live, that we do have to assume those things. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching, and there will be much more content to come. In the meantime, I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.